Okay. So hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our 12 to 12:50 CLAP session today. I'm your session moderator, Stacy Erdman, and I'm the Digital Preservation Librarian at University of Arizona Libraries. Before we begin the session, I want to point everyone to some resources for CLAPS 2022. If you haven't checked out the conference website, I'd urge you to do so, as it contains all the session names and abstracts. The website is at clps.arizona.edu. We also have a detailed session schedule in a Google Sheet that has all the Zoom links for all the individual sessions, and I can paste that into the chat so that you have that handy. As a reminder, the CLAPS opening keynote will be taking place directly following this session at 1 p.m. Pacific time, so make sure you tune into that. Also, if you're a Twitter person, make sure to follow and tweet the CLAPS 2022 hashtag. So now let's get started with our session. I'm pleased to introduce you to our speaker, or to the session, which is titled Citations as Justice, a Critical Approach to Plagiarism Education, and our speaker, Rebecca Yowler. Rebecca resides in Galesburg, Illinois, where she's a librarian for research and instruction at Knox College's Seymour Library. She serves as a liaison to the Religious Studies Department, as well as anthropology, sociology, classics, dance, education, English, first-year programming, gender and women's studies, modern languages, music, peace and justice studies, philosophy, and theater. She also served on the Carly Instruction Committee, attended the ACRL Immersion Program, and recently participated in Carly Counts, a consortial research immersion program. In addition to her work at Knox College, Rebecca is a figure skater and is working towards her adult silver moves. She's competed at U.S. Figure Skating Synchronized Skating Nationals, where her team placed 7th in the U.S. in 2016. She recently won 2 gold medals at U.S. Figure Skating Midwestern Adult Sectionals and competed at U.S. Adult Nationals. She's a national showcase champion and won gold in adult bronze character in 2022 for her portrayal of Ursula. Rebecca will be speaking for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for about 10 minutes of questions. Feel free to put any questions you have about the presentation in the chat at any time, but we'll plan on addressing them once the presentation is completed. So take it away, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Just so you know, my last name is pronounced Yowler, but I didn't tell Stacy that ahead of time. So
sorry about that.
No worries. I am queer, disabled, and neurodivergent, and I bring those identities with me in everything I do. There is a small service dog on my desk. Should he start barking and pawing at the screen, something has gone terribly wrong, and just give me a moment. Somebody already knows Ziggy. That's awesome. So this is a quote that followed the activity that we're going to discuss a little later in our session, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention because it really struck me as an example of how our students responded to this critical approach to plagiarism education. I do want to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that acknowledgements are not always the answer, but are instead a first step towards something better. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are standing on the ancestral lands of the Peoria, Sauk, Muscogee, Miami, Oseti-Sakoan people. We pay respects to their elders past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. And please join us in uncovering such truth at any and all public events. This wording is from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. So we have a few goals today. I'm going to go through some of the frameworks that have and have not worked for discussing plagiarism and citations. Going to look at a few pedagogical approaches. We're going to reframe it a little bit, and then I'm going to show you how we did this year. So let's talk frameworks. A legalistic framework undergirds most of the discussions around plagiarism. And the academic language around plagiarism often relies on legalistic terms and a process that mimics the judicial system. These specific narrow terms leave little room for either the teacher or the student to understand complexities of permission, attribution, and copyright. Discussing plagiarism in terms of cases, reports, and crime statistics further invokes this legalistic understanding. Stefan Sanders discusses this legalistic framing of plagiarism in depth and identifies two major ways in which plagiarism seems to be understood. He states, educators, it seems, make sense of student plagiarism in two ways. Some argue that students don't know how to cite sources or make proper use of texts. Others assume students know full well what is expected of them, and when they plagiarize, they cheat. These two perspectives give rise to two methods of addressing plagiarism, either through education or litigation, or a combination thereof. The belief persists that students are inherently cheats and that honor codes and policies are the definitive answer. But these legalistic terms reflect an institutional legislative stance. Pedagogies based on this stance focus on remediation and prevention so that students don't become duplicitous cheats. Within this legalistic and moralistic framing, then, students come to understanding plagiarism as theft and something to be avoided because they can get caught and punished. In framing plagiarism within this paradigm, we risk become enemies rather than mentors of our students. We are replacing the student-teacher relationship with the criminal-police relationship. Faculty lose the opportunity to build a relationship of co-learning and instead reinforce a hierarchy of dominance and subordination. Furthermore, as with most legal systems, detection and prosecution are not done equitably for all students. Thus, students can face more severe outcomes for the same kind of plagiarism allegation depending on the discipline, faculty, department, or school in which they study. And Kevin Sieber notes that emphasizing punishment without explaining the reasoning behind the rules systematically alienates those students who have not been privileged with past exposure to academic conventions. The balance of power surrounding plagiarism ensures that students who have had the least access to higher education now have the most to fear in the system. A legal framework gives rise to a pedagogy of punishment, which emphasizes discipline, ignores context, and disproportionately impacts students who have had limited exposure to higher ed. This pedagogy then reinforces the notion that students have to earn their way into the academic conversation rather than empower them to write with confidence. Tara Brabazon calls plagiarism a proxy, a strategy to blame the victim rather than consider what happened to higher education in the last 20 years. And I love this quote from Tara, where she talks about what happens when we talk about plagiarism in the first few days of a college experience. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the last piece. I see how we lose our students. I see this shining joy leave their faces. A culture of blame, shame, judgment, and ridicule is created. What we often deny is the intertextual and cross-textual work involved in learning to write, and that gets lost in the sea of anti-plagiarism and mechanics. Students use patchwriting as their first tentative steps into academic writing, and it's a skill, it's an entry-level skill, and where students are trying to assimilate the constructs of unfamiliar discourse. If you're not familiar with patchwriting, Sandra Jameson and Rebecca Moore-Howard write extensively on it. Borrowed phrases and sentence styles comprise much of academic writing, but most writers are eloquent enough to cover their own trail. As Rebecca Howard puts it, when the trail is obvious, we call it plagiarism. When the trail is erased, we call it synthesis, or even original writing. Further, Howard contends that patchwriting shouldn't be considered on the same level as plagiarism, cheating, or even paper purchasing, but rather as a process of imitation and mimicry familiar in the learning tradition. Patchwriting then results from students trying on academic language and expanding their academic vocabulary. Unfortunately, the academic structures that we have in place don't give students and beginning academics the time, skills, or mentoring necessary to complete the complex work of intertextuality. And so that line between intertextuality and plagiarism often gets blurred. Intertextual practices such as paraphrase and patchwriting help students acquire the language of their target community, but this is not easy. Students have to learn to integrate these texts at varying levels as they develop their own authorial identity. But sometimes students write successfully and cite well, but other times students struggle because of the complexities of this intertextual work. I'm going to pause the slides for just a second, and we're going to go back to Jamboard, because the next thing we're going to kind of talk about is common knowledge. So common knowledge is a tricky thing, and how we address it with our students can be problematic. So I'm going to ask you how you talk about common knowledge with your students, and give us just a couple minutes on Jamboard. Do we need the link again?
Yeah, I just put it in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem.
When in doubt, cite. Yes. I hate trying to define it. So do I. Cheesy examples. We all come from different places of knowing. Good. Let me give us just one more minute for the Jamboard, and then I'm going to go on. TLDR, it's deeply contextual. Yes. Oh, we hit it? Oh my gosh. I had no idea Jamboard had a limit. Things we just learned. I apologize. Okay, I am going to move us on. If you want to add your thoughts in chat, that would be more than fine if you couldn't access the Jamboard. So the issue of common knowledge does further complicate the understanding of intertextuality and citation practices. Students struggle with common knowledge and figuring out what should be cited. And they rely on vague, sometimes contradictory definition of what makes something common. Worse yet, librarians who teach the concept often struggle to define common knowledge amongst ourselves, and interpretations of it vary from campus to campus and discipline to discipline. Definitions of common knowledge fail to capture the complexity around knowledge in relation to student writing. If common knowledge is locally defined and understood, then what is considered common knowledge for one student may not be the same for another. The various definitions and understandings of common knowledge do not take into account the dynamic nature of common knowledge and discourse communities. Sorry, my brain just stopped. If institutions have varying descriptions of common knowledge, and those definitions further complicate notions of who is expert in that field, on what day, and in what place, how can students even begin to tease that out? And of course, we teach our students that attribution is key, giving people credit. However, it's problematic. Attribution is at the core issue of citation. We cite because we want to give credit, but also to establish ourselves within the literature and other scholars. Attribution does lend support to arguments. centers the argument within the literature, and helps establish academic credibility. But it can also enforce the status quo and leave difference and diversity out of the conversation. And that's what Mock and Kakyan really discuss in Citation Matters. And that's what that quote is drawn from. While students are not concerned with the issue of hiring, tenure, and performance evaluations, they are being taught about citation and attribution within a system built on those matters. Citations then become an economy in and of themselves. Citations do support an author's claim, but the validity of that claim often depends on whom the author cites and how clearly they define their place within their specific disciplinary community. Attribution can create or reinforce a writer's place within a scholarly community. Thus, citing certain text helps a writer negotiate a place within said community. And each discipline has already established knowledge frameworks and systems so entrenched in practice that they have become invisible over time. Privileging some over others is not without consequences in these systems. But the biggest issue for me with attribution is that attribution relies on the concept of ownership. It is encoded with colonial property privilege and racialized subject positions, which prevent or at least make incredibly difficult those originally excluded from holding that status any entry back in to disrupt or unsettle the conditions inherent in making the record or document. So we're going to dip into some pedagogical approaches. Standard plagiarism education pedagogy focuses on the mechanics of citations and the rules for avoiding plagiarism. These approaches are steeped in the mechanics of citation, admonishing students against plagiarism and showing students the right way to gather and use sources. But the emphasis is clearly on students not plagiarizing. There's a focus on teaching students the rules of the game, but these rules are often complex and unclear. There persists a general understanding that plagiarism education is handled in the first year experience, and that further elimination of plagiarism takes place through software and legalistic interventions where students are punished for violating policy. Further, administrators and faculty seem to believe that if students are just informed of the policies and taught the rules of citation, they will have all the information they need for avoiding plagiarism. But providing guidelines and rules is insufficient. As Robert Briggs notes, such strategy presupposes that the avoidance of plagiarism can be reduced to the mere application of a rule. This is especially true insofar as these guides often provide advice on merely how to cite references, not how to use them. This hyper-focus on mechanics and rules places too much emphasis on not plagiarizing, rather than emphasizing how to engage with the people who created the material. Yet citation style mechanics remain something sacred in academia and have eclipsed perfect grammar and the 5-paragraph theme as the preoccupation of persnickety professors. Emphasis and concern over citation and mechanics thus becomes a proxy for integrity and a stand-in for what academics actually value about ethical, well-sourced argument. An alternative would be to focus less on the mechanics of handbooks and more on helping students situate themselves within often unspoken but very real knowledge-driven practices. Merely listing the rules will not prevent plagiarism. And failure to use sources correctly isn't a moral failure. Transparent use of sources allows students to develop a collaboration between themselves and the text and create knowledge in a way that borrows and builds upon what they read rather than blindly citing or quoting it. Citation then becomes a way for students to borrow knowledge. A successful pedagogical approach would emphasize the development of student writers and minimize emphasis on citation mechanics. The why must come before the how. So we have to reframe the conversation. I'm going to again take us back to Jamboard. And this is about how do you currently discuss the why of citations with your students? If you put your thought on Jamboard and then duck on out, other people can get back in. So that would be great. And if you can't get into Jamboard, please feel free to add your comment in chat. I think I just shared it again. Awesome. I'm blown away that it's full. Leave a trail of what influenced your thinking. I love this. No one is a lone genius. That's great. To honor previous creators of knowledge. Imagine a reader who's excited about the idea and wants to read more. Yeah, I do that a lot. I talk about giving your reader options. It looks like there's some space in the Jamboard. If 50 is the magic number. Great. Ooh, thank you. All right. So in terms of reframing the conversation, we're going to talk about why we would use a critical approach. A more productive framework would be one grounded in pedagogy that values student learning and helps develop an information scaffold that undergirds every subject and every earned degree. Critical theory, decolonization, critical library theory, critical race theory, feminist pedagogy, critical library instruction, all of these come back to a similar common lens to which revision this conversation. It is really just a first step, though, in decolonizing these relationships and practices. Now, I don't feel the need to over-explain critical approaches in general. We are at a critical librarianship conference, so I assume there's an underground knowledge of what we know, but we know the major players, Freire, Hooks, and specific to librarianship, Elmborg. But what is most important is that we resist the concept that paid resources are inherently better, and that we highlight traditionally marginalized scholars, and we nurture students' understanding of how information and knowledge are formed by unequal power relations based on class, race, gender, and sexuality. A critical approach to information literacy will place information within context and will acknowledge relationships to power. Critical information literacy provides opportunities for students to discuss the power inherent within the processes around the creation and dissemination of information, and it looks for opportunities to expand the conversation into a more diverse dialogue. Critical librarianship resists capitalist conceptions of library work, neoliberalism, and other dominant ideologies and complex structures which serve to oppress. Shar Booth puts it this way. We are critical educators when we compel ourselves and others to think about power and privilege, and we are feminist educators when we dig beneath the status quo of our content and indemnify justice-focused approaches to engaging learners in a process of safe, radical, self and system examination. Librarians are uniquely situated to lead a critical approach to citation because while administrators establish academic policies and teaching faculty are largely bound to enforce them, librarians operate occupy a separate space. To be clear, it's not a neutral space. There's nothing neutral about what we do. It is instead a space where we can focus on developing pedagogies that truly value student learning rather than push a disciplinary agenda. But none of this is good unless we can frame it within an understanding of Generation Z and their inherent concerns for social justice and equality. Students in Generation Z are most interested in learning that allows for social change, and they are passionate in their advocacy for social change. Gen Z students are motivated by a sense of responsibility and not wanting to let someone down. They're also motivated by rewards, not gifts, not credit, not public recognition, but a reward. They're not motivated by public recognition or competition or quid pro quo. Gen Z students prefer an environment that is inclusive and supportive, and where students are treated like intellectuals in training who have something worthwhile to say. Can you mute, Althea, would you mind muting, please? Thank you. Such an environment allows students to explore academic concepts without feeling like they don't have any skill or background knowledge to excel. A social justice approach to information literacy and plagiarism awareness then would appeal to Gen Z's desire for empowerment. This type of instruction is a social imperative as librarians are responsible in helping students become sustainable learners, citizens who cultivate networks of information that compel them to pursue fairness, equality, and basic human rights. Social justice pedagogy and critical pedagogy are closely related, as both emphasize the connection between information and power structures. So if you attended the session earlier on the framework, we talked about this quite a bit. The framework itself, the ACRL framework for information literacy, is problematic and steeped in white supremacist language. But Laura Saunders has proposed an information social justice frame. And I think this is a really helpful frame to consider when we talk about how social justice and critical pedagogy can work together. Information is created within existing power structures, and those power structures can impact the production and dissemination of information, as well as distort, suppress, or misrepresent information. To understand and use information most effectively, users must be able to examine and interrogate the power structures that impact that information and analyze the ways that information can be used to both inform and misinform. We are going to take a quick sachet into breakouts. Stacy is going to pop you into a breakout room. There is the next 2 slides on the Jamboard are for your group. If your group ends up talking about something else entirely, that's fine. But I want you to think about how you've already reframed the conversation at your institution and any ideas you might have for an activity that would take into consideration these approaches. And Stacy, if you could send folks, that would be great.
No problem.
Fingers crossed this works.
Yeah. Okay.
You're muted, Rebecca.
Okay, here I am. Sorry. In the fall of 2022, we developed a new lesson plan for teaching academic integrity as part of our first year preceptorial courses at Knox College. When I was looking over all the presenters today, I noticed how many of them are from giant R1 schools that have fancy university titles. So to be clear, we are tiny. We have 1,200 students. We're a small private liberal arts school out on the prairie in Galesburg, Illinois. We are only undergraduate students, and all of our first year students are required to take a first year preceptorial course. That's a subject-based intro to college, but not course that sometimes has a common reading. These courses are affectionately referred to as FP, and all sections are FP are required to come to the library for academic integrity instruction, and I am responsible for that. So while previous iterations of learning goals in this area had come directly from the faculty, were just to demonstrate an understanding of academic integrity and cite properly. Over the summer, our faculty approved a new learning goal, and that was that students will demonstrate ethical integrity, not only as a producer of academic knowledge, but as a member of all their communities. This was a pretty big shift. They added some changes and some notes regarding this goal. Stacy, I'm going to go just 5 minutes more so I can get
Sure.
through this. So
That's fine.
So these were some of their explanations for why they changed this. I'm going to just highlight that students should show that they can ethically and responsibly produce knowledge, not solely or even primarily by avoiding plagiarism, but instead by taking on the ethical responsibilities of academic study. To me, this was an aha moment when our faculty really got it. They saw the difference between plagiarism and actually being involved in the conversation. These caveats marked a significant departure from our previous goal. And while our previous lesson plan had these activities around common knowledge, when to cite, citation mechanics, this new perspective reflected a more critical understanding, and so gave us an opportunity. We had already made some changes to our lesson plan, but this let us do even more. So we shifted away from rules and shifted towards discussion, and shifted even more on who should be credited. And we relied on two key activities. The first is a discussion of this overproduced, slick honor code video that has so many messed up things in it, I can't even begin to talk about it. But I want to talk briefly about this 10 seconds. Hopefully, oh shoot, I was hoping you could hear it, but let me just tell you what it says. It says, Ismat Khatani, class of 51, who 30 years later would be elected president of the UN General Assembly, teamed up with another Knox College student to found the honor code. Teamed up with another Knox student to found the honor code. Students really latched onto this and wanted to know who that other student was and why he wasn't given credit in the video. Well, he wasn't given credit because he wasn't president of the UN General Assembly. Students had a problem with that. Good. And so they developed a rallying cry. What about Glenn? The other student's name is Glenn Lefebvre. And students are now very offended that Glenn was omitted. And in fact, we have heard on campus recently, what about Glenn being mentioned whenever Ismat Khatani's name comes up, which I think is a huge victory. Yay, Ismat, but also what about Glenn? The other part of the other thing we did was, was an activity called Who Gets the Credit, where students would determine who should get the credit for various inventions, discoveries, or innovations. And this is the list of discoveries or inventions that I used. And there's a PDF that includes a picture of the invention, some information, and a QR code to both a Google sheet where Google form that they filled out about the item and an article on the item. And those, I'll give you all those in links momentarily. I want to share some of their responses with you because this is what blew my mind, and the response that I showed you at the beginning of the session also. They got it. She was a grad student and found it. Her professor took credit and she lost out on the Nobel Prize. He was an enslaved Black person who built his way to freedom and later helped other enslaved people who were on the Underground Railroad, but couldn't patent it due to racism. Otto didn't give Lise credit for the invention because she was a Jewish woman and would have been a career killer for him in Germany to list one in a paper of his. Students were grappling with the ideas of power and inequity just by digging into these inventions. Students grappled with the privilege and the whiteness and the patriarchy. And in nearly every session, the common realization was that power and race greatly impacted the way credit was given. Students often became animated and even angry as they read about discoveries and who had been denied credit or reward. From these discussions, the lesson pivoted into a brief discussion of how we give credit to someone in an academic context. I will share all of these, yes. This is the first time in the entire lesson that we actually talked about citations. And it was just a teeny tiny part of the overall lesson. In fact, the final slide was an exit ticket where students had to scan 2 QR codes. One was a link to the library homepage and one was a link to the Purdue OWL. And they weren't allowed to leave until I saw them bookmarked on their phones. Undertaking this new approach was scary. We had to give up a lot of our inner drive towards giving all the information and explaining every aspect of common knowledge, and we had to trust that students would take home the lesson that we wanted them to. It forced us to be flexible. And while we have been working slowly towards revisions of our lesson plan in previous years, the change in the lesson goal really moved us forward. Creating the Who Gets the Credit activity was the biggest challenge, but the research on critical approaches moved us in that direction. We just needed to trust that it would help students think critically. And our trust was not misplaced. Student reactions to this session were better than any of the other academic integrity sessions I've taught over 6 years. And they were generally miffed at the history of misattribution, and they were impassioned about Glenn Lefebvre and the other people who had missed out. Lessons and approach still need revisions. This is our first year trying something completely new, and we've learned enough to move forward. So we're going to continue to shift and move as we go through. I know I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I will send you all these links. I'm going to put them in the chat. Thank you for the info on Excelsior. I'm going to stop sharing. And
do you want people to send the questions in chat or unmute themselves? Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you. Either way, you can unmute yourself too.
We haven't really had any questions come up thus far. Just a lot of helpful comments.
Awesome. And can I have a link to those comments? How does that work?
So we have the transcript.
Perfect.
So we'll have that, and I've been keeping track of some of the comments. But yeah, I'd say we can get the transcript for you.
Perfect. So the first link is a link to the work cited for everything in this presentation. The second one is the actual lesson plan that I used and I wrote for our academic integrity. The third is the slide deck that I use with our students. The fourth is the Who Gets the Credit activity. And the last is a link to this presentation. If you want to look at it now, it'll also be later up on the website. I'm always happy to answer questions. outside of this opportunity, let me make sure that I share with you. My email is rayowler@knox.edu.
Looks like a question's come in.
Yes.
Have you seen or read anything about name dropping and citation practices, like as a
Yeah,
form of virtue signaling?
it is a form of virtue signaling, and it's even more than virtue signaling. It is status signaling. Like citing the right people means that you've done the right work, and there is quite a bit of that in the in my bibliography. There's some of that. So thank you, Ben. Yeah. And in the slides, there's also a link to the actual paper that this presentation was based on. So thank you all so much for coming. I'm happy to answer questions privately or via email, and I'm happy to share more about the activities we did. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Becca, for this wonderful presentation and to everyone for attending. So please join me in a round of virtual applause for Becca.
Yeah.
And this session will be, it's been recorded, so it'll be available later for viewing. So hope to see you at some other clap sessions. Oh.